All right, everyone. I'm Dave McLeod. I'm the CEO of Thoughtexchange, and I am honored and extremely pleased to be bringing in this leadership live discussion with Dr. Kevin McGowan from Brighton School District. Welcome, Kevin. Thank you for joining us here.
Thanks, Dave. My pleasure. Glad to be on with everybody and with you.
Fantastic. So here's the shape of the session. I'm going to go through and give a bit of context for this leader discussion and some exchanges that have run. Then we're going to back up, and I'm going to have Kevin tell a story that I think is really important, and I think it's one that really need to understand and really consider the impact of. When Kevin told us to me, I said we need to get this story into the hands of as many people as possible. Dr. McGowan has been superintendent in Brighton, New York. Prior to Brighton, Kevin was superintendent of Warsaw. And having spent some time with him, I believe it's a gift and honor of working in different settings and facilitating development, period, of anything curricular and financial, but also just, I would say, the overall connection between humans. And as a bit more background, Brighton was a Thoughtexchange customer, and they've already run 10 exchanges. They've had thousands of thoughts submitted. Those things have been rated lots and lots of times. And by the way, thoughts being rated is my favorite metric because it's really a time when someone has a chance to empathize with the thought of a different human. And I think that's really important. So you can see in this conversation, there's about 700 people that actually were taking time to consider and rate the thinking of one another in a community. And this is a question about how do you feel about Foot Patrol partnership with Brighton Police Department? What else should we consider? Another question that they asked at a different time was 1,000 people. What are our district doing well, and what are some things we can focus on in order to improve? Have all sorts of interesting, impactful conversations, but I'm going to actually back it up a little bit and go back to this. The topic of this conversation is sort of vulnerability and leadership and how it pertains to the safety conversation. So maybe, Kevin, I'll turn it over to you just for a moment. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'd like to turn it over to you to sort of set the stage, maybe with I'd like to start with, well, you'd use Thoughtexchange for this, and then you realized you had to have a conversation about safety. Maybe you could just start there. We used it for this sort of thing, and then we realized safety was important. Why? Over to you.
Good question. So, Dave, we had used it for that kind of climate check, the end of year, how are we doing and what can we do better, that fed into our strategic planning process in the district, an opportunity for all of our stakeholders to come together and shape the work of the district for the following year. And the results from that first exchange gave us a bunch of great themes, broke down. People could see the comments, they could do some analysis and really facilitate strategic planning with all that great information. And so last year, after our police department locally had been asking for quite a while to engage with us in a program where the officers would get out of their car and patrol through our high school. So, you know, we have a security staff, we don't have school resource officers. They just said, we'd like to be able to pop in once in a while, walk through maybe every day at random times, get to know your security staff, get to know kids better, and get to know the layout of the building better. And we had pushed back on that for quite a long time and said, you know what, it's not real comfortable. It just something didn't feel great about that. And we didn't want to do that. It's not that we don't have this great relationship with them, but a program like that just wasn't something we were interested in. And so Parkland happened, sadly, and that kind of changed a lot in terms of people's perception around safety and what we thought were the right things to be doing. And the police chief and I spoke shortly after that. He said, again, would you be interested in having foot patrols? And very quickly and without a lot of feedback or input, my response was absolutely, let's start that. So informed our community, let them know we're going to start this right away. And that was very much about people feeling safer and feeling as though more police presence could help. I don't think we were under the illusion that somehow that would be the only measure that would prevent a school shooting, but it was one of those reactionary things where we felt like, you know, if we could provide some kind of police presence, that people would feel better about that. But as I've said to you, Dave, and we've talked about this, we completely blew it. You know, we implemented the program, we put a letter out, we told people we were doing it, and our community is about 70% majority white population. 30% other, broken down into a lot of different categories, but about 9% African American. That's a key number. Because what we found was that the program started, people initially felt great about that, or so we heard or thought. And as the school year wound down last year and we had just completed our exchange, that climate exchange, we were starting to get feedback that maybe we ought to be asking people how they feel about this specific program, this foot patrol program, so to speak.
Maybe,
So this,
maybe
oh,
just
sorry.
yeah, just go into that a little bit. So you said, so what does that look like? What sort of feedback were you getting around the football patrol? How, like, what sort of people? How were you? So I'm interested in the, well, you hear something, it's interesting. Maybe we should talk to everybody, but I'm also interested in the, you heard from a few people that were really interested, and then how do you actually take that and like sort of verify it or have a bigger conversation? But maybe talk about like, what did that look and feel like for you when people were saying, I don't know, Dr. McGowan, you might want to consider this again. Maybe dig
Yeah.
into that a little more.
So what happened was, member for the first real kind of indication where I started to think, we may have missed something here was a meeting requested by our Black Student Union in our high school. So a student-run club that asked myself, the police chief, and the principal to come to one of their meetings and answer some questions. And we've gone to them before and had a great dialogue about a variety of issues. And they said, could you come and talk to us? And we said, sure, we'd be happy to. And we went and had this discussion with them, and they said, what kind of feedback, these are kids, which was remarkable, right? Often the greatest knowledge we can gather is from the mouths of kids. They said, hey, did you ever think about asking this? Did you ever think about kind of measuring this or thinking about how it would make people feel? And have you considered the idea that a lot of young African American people feel very disconnected from police officers, not just disconnected, but feel threatened by their interactions with the relationships and the possibilities of what could happen in those interactions with police officers? And we had a really good discussion. We explained the objectives as I had laid them out, to get to know kids better, the buildings better, and our security plans, and seemed to explain it to them. But it was clear to me, even in the discussion, that even though we could explain it, and to be very candid, three white guys with privilege explaining it to the Black Student Union, it seemed from this position of power and privilege, like, oh, well, that makes sense, and they'll be fine with it. I mean, come on, how can you argue with more police officers in schools, right? These are great people. They're in and out of the buildings all the time. We know them well. We don't specifically have or have ever had really a problem in our town around police officer relationships with kids. So big deal. Like, this seems okay, but it just, something didn't feel right. And we had some community members also, and some community members part of a group that was talking to us about diversity, equity, inclusion, race relations, and being much more culturally responsive, saying to us, you ought to be thinking about this. Have you really considered this? And what are you going to do to measure this? What are you going to do to give feedback on it? And so, it was really those two kind of data points where we started to say, we ought to be looking at this more than we are right now. There was also a political issue happening in town, and around the politics of this, because our essentially municipalities are completely separate, the town, the police force, and the school. But the town's police force was providing this service, and there were questions coming up through town government around, a particular town board member and members of the town board essentially saying, we'd like you to make sure you're asking for feedback. And there was one community forum held through the town. The police chief gathered some people and said, oh, I'm happy to talk about this, but talk about safety overall. And it was not well attended. There wasn't a lot of community outpouring. But again, you put all those things together and we just got a general sense something doesn't feel right. And if it doesn't feel right, maybe we ought to be asking more questions.
That's great. Last week, I had the privilege of listening to Dr. Quentin Shepard give a presentation that I was impacted by. I thought it was a really great language. It's really about the transfer, the leadership, where leadership is evolving, is going from a place to where leaders are closed and knowing. And then there's this moment, there's this really important, really tiny moment that you actually transfer the threshold from someone who's closed and knowing into someone who's open and learning. That's a really great definition of vulnerability, and it's a definition of the evolution of leadership. It seems to me, what you just heard from everybody, which is great. You said, well, how can we improve our schools? All sorts of things like that. I mean, there's lots of moments there of growing and learning. It's a pretty vulnerable question, actually, to have everyone sharing their thoughts.
Sure.
And then you got to this spot where it's actually, I think you could have reacted in two kinds of ways. One is people said, well, this is the thing. You said, actually, you know what? I know the right thing to do. And thank you for your feedback, but I'm in control here. I'm in charge. And I know the answer, or at least I can pretend that I know the answer. And so we're going to do it this way. And you took a different approach and said, actually, all right, you know what? Maybe I should know more. I should actually ask the question. Here's the thing I don't know. And back to, it was on the slide there, which is actually, let's talk about this issue of foot patrols. What are some things that we should be considering, and anything else you want to talk about in order to make our schools safer for kids? So maybe just transfer, like, tell me about that moment of like accepting and leadership saying, I want to be open, I want to be learning. And then talk me through that process of how you're like, actually, let's do a follow-up exchange as kind of as fast as possible and get that out into people. Maybe just tell me how that happened and why that happened.
Yeah, so I love Quentin's expression of that last week. I think that was incredibly empowering. That idea of vulnerability and the strength actually that comes from vulnerability, I think, is an important aspect of that to be thinking about. So for us, we have a community that is traditionally deeply collaborative. You know, we have large committees to figure out how many paper clips to buy, not to be like, you know, silly about that, but we've always invited a lot of feedback. But we've also entered a strange time right now. Your description of that's really interesting when you said, you know, the idea that we could have probably just said, hey, we know the right thing to do and we're going to keep doing this. And I would say that with regard to a police force that's generally well respected in town and things go pretty well and we seem to have a safe environment, we could have, quote unquote, gotten away with that probably forever, because the reality is the 70% majority white population from a place of implicit bias and privilege would have said, I don't understand. And by the way, they did say at times, I don't understand. Like, why wouldn't you want police officers to be in the school? I don't get this, which they absolutely didn't get it. So it was a question of, yeah, being vulnerable and saying, but it's not working for all the members of our school community. And I think just being in touch with, you know, recognizing that underrepresented groups and everybody who's here should have an equal voice in the conversation, should have a voice that sometimes needs to be pulled out, you know, physically pulled out more so than the voice that's right in front of us, that's active, that's engaged, that's always here, that's a part of things. And so it's a question of just being open and vulnerable to that. So there was that moment where it, almost hard to describe. I'm using a lot of words probably to get at that, but this moment where it felt like something's not quite right, we should ask more questions and engage in a deeper conversation about what seems to us as a perfectly reasonable strategy, but not everybody feels that way. And we try and be respectful of how everybody feels and not do things by a 51% majority. We're looking for a much greater consensus around here in most cases.
That's great. So I think that's great. So can you transition in, and Sean, we're actually going to go, I forgot to say this at the start, but we're going to tell the rest of this story in about 15 minutes. And in fact, we're going to go into an exchange and hear back all the thoughts and questions. There's going to be a lot of them, I think, from this. And so we're going to do an exchange so we can hear back from everybody. And then we're going to take time for the rest to actually address as many of the top thoughts and questions that we can hear live. But maybe transition for me. All right, so you said, let's go ahead and have this conversation. So why don't you tell me a story of, so you sent a question out, talk about the question, and then, yeah, what happened there? What happened, and then just keep going.
Right, so there's an interesting moment where, okay, we're going to go out and ask this question. And we talked with the police chief and the town supervisor about, you know, this is how we'd like to gather the information. How do you feel about that? It was a pretty collaborative discussion. And in their mindset, it was much more about, well, just put a survey out, you know, just ask people, SurveyMonkey, whatever it is, and get that kind of feedback. And the interesting discussion that happened with regard to that was, you know, to what end? So what are we going to find out through that? That simply turns into a vote. And again, one, we don't do things by 51%. Another is that that vote is very much going to be skewed by the 70% or so of, again, the people that possess privilege, power, and some implicit bias, who would probably say, well, I don't understand. What is the issue? And I'm not saying everybody is unaware of that issue, but for the most part, culturally, I think that that's what would have happened. And you wouldn't really see anything in terms of open-ended kind of feedback that would be very worthwhile, particularly because it would likely be interpreted, coded by, themed by people with that same privilege, power, and implicit bias. So, you know, our discussion with them was, here's a much better way to get at the information. Let's do an exchange, and let me explain to you what an exchange is, and let me go through this with you. And here's what will happen. It won't just be about people saying yes or no. It'll be about people saying, here's how I feel about it, and for their friends and neighbors to engage in a discussion that is a two-way discussion. They are not just offering feedback, they are at the same time receiving feedback, and a significant amount of feedback. not filtered through people interpreting it, administrators or whomever, but real live, here's how my friends and neighbors feel, in a way that's very powerful, because it's not one person shouting over another. It's not people with a microphone at a podium who only the extroverts get their word in. It's everybody. And the anonymity of it allows for people to be much more vulnerable but safe in that vulnerability. And for us as a school community, as administrators, we were very willing to be vulnerable to that conversation. We really wanted to know how people felt. And you asked about vulnerability. That, to me, is empowering to us, and it's empowering to our school community. So we put that out. That's how we got to that point in the discussion. We very wisely, at the advice of your colleagues, Dave, asked a more open-ended question. So it wasn't just about foot patrols, because the fear was, if you just ask about foot patrols, a very small number of people might weigh in, only the people that feel very strongly about that one issue. And you want to bring in a lot more, many more perspectives. And we wanted to gather all sorts of information while we had people's attention and while they were in the exchange. So we asked a more broad question about not just foot patrols, but other safety strategies. Went ahead and did that. I think you had the number up before. It was right around 700, maybe 694 responses. So that was open to our high school staff, students, and parents from the high school to weigh in on that. Of course, the link went out and could have traveled to a lot of other people too, but generally it seemed to break down that way, and received an unbelievable amount of feedback.
So that's great. So what happened? So tell me about the sort of things that you heard and the sort of things that came out in that exchange, and why that was important.
Well, we heard about, the more mundane but important to many people, things like you should put more lights in the parking lot, and you should think about this entrance right here, or when kids come in this door here, it could be unsafe. The kinds of things that, for whatever reason, through the different safety planning we had done, we may not have heard, but because we called the question and people had this open-ended opportunity to offer feedback, we got a lot more information for our safety committee to process, for our building principals to process. It was really worthwhile in that respect. But then we received, the majority of feedback was about the foot patrols. And it was striking in so many ways. For one, it was, it hurt to read some of the comments, because we did not recognize, when I say we blew it, as we started to have this sense, and the reason we were going out for feedback, something didn't feel right. When you read the pain that you have caused somebody, it hurts. However, it also is a tremendous opportunity to fix that hurt, to not re-victimize a person or a group of people, to pull them out of some kind of marginalization. Whereas if we had asked differently, for example, in a survey, 70% of white people may have said, hey, makes perfect sense, why not do that? You're re-marginalizing or marginalizing, re-victimizing a group of people who feel like, okay, now again, my opinion doesn't matter because I'm not in the majority, right? So the exchange gave us a huge number of comments and highly rated comments around, I'm really concerned about armed officers in the building. And essentially comments that I'd summarize boiled down to things like, what if my child gets into a fight or is having some kind of difficulty? What kind of training do police officers have to intercede with young people in the school setting to address that? And although I think our police officers are well trained and we've had lots of conversations about that, we didn't do very specific training around, and the intent was not for them to be patrolling necessarily and handling day-to-day discipline. It was the other objectives that I mentioned, but that doesn't matter. That's easy for me to say, again, with a person with privilege and power and implicit bias. I've been exposed to a couple of different pieces recently, one of which is a very simple example. You search on YouTube for the Procter & Gamble The Talk video. It's about a 2.5, 3-minute video. The incredible burden that is, and pain that people carry, particularly African-American young people and their parents, around this issue, and around the many times where these atrocities have happened to young people, African-American young people. And we didn't get that. And the comments, we got it pretty clearly. We didn't do enough to train. We didn't implement it very well. We didn't go and talk to people ahead of time. We just really took it for granted that we're doing the safe thing, and people worry about school shootings. We ought to have police officers in the building. But the feedback told us you missed it. You missed it in a big way because you didn't think about how anxious it would make my child feel. And they go to school to be away from being anxious. They go to school to learn, to engage with their friends, to think differently, to develop as a human being. They shouldn't have to worry about the police officer standing there with his hands on his hip, which, by the way, police officers often stand with their hands on their hip, but for some people, that looks like standing with your hands on your gun. And so this is here we pride ourselves on this positive, engaging, wonderful school environment. We have a really great environment in our high school and our middle school. All of our buildings, this was focused there. And yet we brought an outside agency and kind of force in that felt coercive. It felt negative. It felt like they were looking for something. It felt hurtful, and it made people, young people, particularly young African American people, incredibly anxious. Now, it also would appear as though there were other kids that it made feel anxious too. They didn't like the idea of somebody patrolling around their building. There were all sorts of other connotations to the idea of a patrol. I took it very much for granted because that was the language the police chief and I had been using, but we have an open campus. We're one of the rare places in our area that still has that. It's very much like a college atmosphere. And then we created patrols. It was so contrary to our culture. So the comments were layered and all these threads around coerciveness and around anxiety and just hurtfulness, and not considering the idea that for many members of our community, that would cause pain, that would cause anxiety, that could cause just a potential problem. And we hadn't considered that.
That's great. And I want to dig into, so for a lot of people listening and for a lot of people thinking about this, frankly, vulnerability kind of sucks, because you're right, it does hurt. And when you ask a question that you don't know the answer to, it also could have come out the other way. What do you thought about the foot patrols? You know what? I think it's a great idea. And this time, fantastic. I know there's some concerns, but let's work together and let's make the best of it. It could have gone that way. You really didn't know what was going to happen. It really could have been, one or two people worried, but in general, people are not worried. But there's also, I think, a bunch of people who would listen and say, well, I never want to be in your situation. I'd rather not know than go through what you just described, which was having to actually come to terms with other people's anxieties and come to terms with them. Yet you describe this as a leadership strength. You describe this as something that's actually moved you forward in your leadership and has actually benefited you. Why don't you tell me about what were the benefits now? What happened with you and your community moving forward? So there's a lot of these people sharing these comments. They're actually rated quite high. It seems by actually many people, not just the small group, but actually everyone's resonating a fair bit with these sort of things and saying, yeah, here's a bunch of stuff that's coming up to the top. And now all of a sudden, like, what did you do with that? And why was that important to you as a leader?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me break that down. First, with 700 people participating and those comments getting high ratings, it would be impossible for only members of our African American community to be rating those high. So what it also said to us was this was resonating with many, many people in our community, which I thought was a very positive thing. Also, this idea of being in an exchange helped so much because it forced our community to look at itself and to reflect on its behaviors, its own implicit bias. Maybe subconsciously in some ways, but because people had to engage in other people's thinking and see these comments and then rate them, they saw the pain that had been caused to their friends and neighbors, and it mattered to them. They were willing to say, okay, I must have had it wrong. I didn't realize the people next to me, the person next to me, feels this way. And because we gave a space for people to express that, everybody was able to see that, which has also resulted, by the way, in I'll tell you about the change, but no negative feedback from our majority community, our white community, saying, I can't believe you did that. Why did you take patrols out of the building? It feels to me as though because they saw those comments and they saw that pain firsthand, they have somehow shifted their mindset as well around this.
Right.
Because
so actually tell everyone, unpack that a little bit. Tell them that story. So what happened then is, so you got the results of the exchange, you gathered together, you made some different decisions, you communicated them out, and then you ended up at city meetings hearing other people talking about the impact of that. So yeah. Wrap up. So how'd that go? What was the change? And then how did you hear about it again after in the community?
Yeah, so as soon as the exchange ended, we put out, we took kind of like the initial results and shared them with our safety committee, with a group of community members who had been most engaged in this discussion around foot patrols and diversity, inclusivity, equity kind of issues. And we shared top 10 comments from each group. We kind of showed the hot topics. We showed the how different groups felt, and it was interesting because we could see how students fell into one place, staff members fell into a very different place, and kind of what the relationships were between those thoughts and their starring patterns. It was fascinating data. It also helped us in that analysis to know what we needed to work on with our staff in terms of communicating. It's kind of what need the foot patrols were filling for staff members and how we needed to talk through that with staff members to still fill that need. But essentially what we did was we communicated very quickly that we had suspended the foot patrols, and we sent out to the entire community, here's a link to get to the information. Please check it out. Go back into the exchange as the final analysis is being done and check out where things ended. The exchange is over at this point, and we'll get back to you when the rest of the data is available. And then we said to people, in the meantime, we've suspended the foot patrols, and what we are committed to doing is meeting our objectives for officers to find better ways to engage with students, for our security staff to engage with police officers, and for our police officers to know our grounds, our campus well. But we can do that in ways that are much more effective without marginalizing our population, without putting people in these uncomfortable positions. And we missed that. We're sorry. We should have done that differently and expressed that in a lot of different ways. And so we're going to work with stakeholders, and we talked about our families of color. We have a support group of families of color and our safety committee and other stakeholder groups. We kind of left it as those plans are developed. And when they're available, we'll get back to you and let you know how it's going. So not too many weeks later, a police officer had stopped by the building, had an interaction with our staff, simple like stopped in because police officers are in and out all the time for regular kind of business. And then there was a question asked at a town board meeting. It was more about a resource question. Like, I saw this police officer, I thought we weren't doing that. And it was interesting to me to hear a whole different group of people not engage with Thoughtexchange the way we are, talking about, well, there was this thing called the Thoughtexchange, and there's this other information, and this data shared. But it was this really fascinating dialogue then that pushed the town board and that dialogue there to a different place around thinking about the perspectives of different people in the community and being more inclusive in decision making and respecting that people have different perspectives. And it's okay to call that question. It's okay to ask that question. That being okay with being vulnerable. You mentioned this before, and I want to share this thought. It's really a win-win, because at the end of the day, if we had asked the question and people said, no, it's a great thing, we should be doing it, then we felt very comfortable. We could go back and work with community groups and say, okay, we still want to talk to you about your concern. We still want to adapt whatever we're doing so people feel better about this. But here's what the community is feeling like, and you were a part of this exchange too. So here's the deal. And that would have worked out fine. And on the other side of that, by finding out that we blew it and we should have been doing it differently, we win in the sense, not that it's a game, but we win in the sense that our community feels so much better about that. All members of our community feel so much better about it. The other context I should point out that, without us taking the whole time to tell this story, we also at the same time have been dealing with other issues around diversity, equity, inclusion, going back to a year and a half ago now or so, when we really made more efforts as a district formally, but then issues that came up over the summer and a couple of different things that had happened that we needed to address areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we were actively. So we've done a whole bunch of other things, not related necessarily to foot patrol, but around that topic. And it would seem as though months later now, removed from some summertime things that had come up, we're in a much, much better place. Trust has been developed. We're engaged right now with members of the community that we hadn't been well engaged with. And I think they feel, at least they're expressing, they feel as though we are listening. And they were a big part of the exchange. And they feel now that we've engaged with them and they have a voice and they're part of problem solving, and that their outcomes will be better because we are a team right now. And they didn't feel that way before.
That's great. So thank you very much. I really believe that there's something in here that is deeply important for people to really understand. I think that there's a concern at leadership level that says you know what, I have a concern that if I ask this question and then I screwed up, I'm going to have to say I screwed up, and then I will lose trust from my community, because they will see that I made, all of a sudden, as if the decision that I made will suddenly be revealed, as if people don't already feel this way, that if I ask the question, the mistake I made will be revealed, and otherwise it never would have been revealed, and I will have to say I changed my mind, and I will lose trust. Except that's the closed and knowing way of actually perceiving the world. The conversation's actually happening out there. And as someone who says, actually, I'm open and learning, and you're saying, I made a mistake. I made a mistake because, I was really concerned about kids. I think I made it for a really human kind of a way. I wanted to do what's best. I was worried. We all were worried. And now I think I found a better way. And actually, you increase trust by admitting a mistake. And I see you do it publicly. And to be able to say, listen, I'm trying to do my best here. I'm a human, I'm a leader, and I'm trying to do my best. And that actually builds trust in leadership, to admit your mistakes, versus when you make a mistake, everyone says, you're right, you made a mistake, I don't trust you anymore. So I just think that that's a really important thing that's underneath this conversation for people to consider. And with that, what I want to do for the remainder of this call is that right now there's a link coming into the exchange. So leadership's about listening. I'd like everyone to go into this exchange and share 1 or 2 thoughts or questions you have about the discussion so far, and then try to rate, if you could rate at least 20 thoughts the next, 6 minutes. You can just go in, you don't have to sign up. If this is your first exchange, you can just press continue. You don't have to sign up or log in. Go in there and share a question or 2 or a thought or reflection, and then rate 10 or 20 in the next 5 minutes or so. And we're going to take whatever comes up to the top, and we're going to spend some time reflecting back to that. We're also going to model some open and learning, because we don't know what's going to come up, and Kevin's going to have to speak on his toes. But as you've seen in this part, I think he's the sort of leader that can handle such a thing and speak honestly. So I'm also going to do something for those of you that are slightly extroverted. I share a lesson, I like to share it a lot, which is that as an extroverted leader, I actually like to fill the space with noise and distraction, because I get uncomfortable in silence. I even considered at one point, this is a completely true story, of creating a music feature so that when people were participating in an exchange, music would blare through your end of the computer to help you with your process. And everyone who is not an extrovert like me is like, that is crazy. Can you just shut up, please, and let me think for a minute or 2? And so that's a lesson I had to learn as a leader, is that, in fact, I might go into a coffee shop and I love being surrounded by noise when I think, and not everybody works that way. So sorry, extroverts, you can blast music in your own room. I'm going to be quiet here. We're just going to let you share some thoughts and rate 10 to 20 thoughts. And in about 4 minutes, we're going to come back online and we're going to go up, show you what's up to the top. In a couple minutes, I'm going to actually just share what's happening in the exchange. So if you're done your 10 or 20 thoughts, come back here and you'll be able to see that. All right, these are good. These are some good reflections and questions. So I'm going to have you finish your final bit of rating in here. All right, I'm going to close off this exchange now. So thank you very much for everyone who's put this in. I'm going to press close so we can spend the rest of our time together discussing what's come up to the top. And whatever we don't get to here in the next 17 minutes, we'll actually create some more responses and send those out afterwards. So I'm just going to open up the top thoughts here. So those are the themes that came out, but this is just a comment that I think humility is an important leadership trait. Good role models admit and grow from mistakes, many times coming up with even more powerful solutions. It's also connected to number 2. I'm struck by the idea of leadership admitting openly to its mistakes. I think this would bring others into the conversation to help the situation. I mean, yes, and Kevin, why don't make a comment on that? Because I think it's something that you've embraced, but I don't think everyone can just sort of openly embrace that. So maybe comment on how people can get to that spot.
I'd say for one, if you haven't tried it, try it. It feels pretty good to just be open and honest with somebody and say, you know what, I was wrong. I didn't do that very well. I'm sure at some point with people, apologies get old and then that causes even more distrust. Like, well, he'll just do whatever he wants and then apologize later. I'm sure it could create that. But I have found that for the most part, what you're doing is essentially saying, here's what my motivation was. I'm not perfect all the time. And it brings people in the conversation in a much different place. they're much more willing then to collaborate and try and figure something out with you and feel good about their collaboration with you when they feel like you're being an open, honest partner. People know that the people around them are not perfect all the time. And so when you, I think, try and behave like you are, you've automatically created a lie. You've created a fallacy, and people resent that, and that builds over time. What doesn't build over time is resentment about humility or resentment about people making mistakes. Most people, most of the time, want to accept you for who you are and what you've done, that it's well motivated.
That's great. Most people, most of the time, want to accept you for who you are. I wholeheartedly agree. These next two are actually also, they're tied together. This is great. How are students talking about their experience here? Have you gone back to the student group and did they feel more empowered? Did you get any feedback from them afterwards and this change was made?
Yeah, not yet, not as much as I would like to. It's been pretty brief. We haven't really had an in-depth conversation. There was some brief interactions and they're aware of it and reacted positively to that. I met with particularly the officers of the Black Student Union and had a discussion about the exchange, and it was pretty positive. Like, yeah, you listened, that's good, and let's keep working on these things. There's more work to do. But I'm looking forward to more conversation with them as well, particularly as we say, okay, here were the results, but here's now how we think we'd like to move forward with some different strategies. How do you feel about those? I think that's really where the heart of the conversation is going to be.
That's great. I think that's a really interesting moment for anybody to consider, is that you can all reflect back at a time in your life when a leader that you looked up to as a mentor actually turned to you for advice, and then you actually affected their thinking, and they said, actually, thank you for that. That really changed the way I think about something, and how that impacted you as a leader to say, wow, I just affected the thinking of someone who's a leader above me and has some control and power over me, and just how that felt. I think everyone can remember a time when someone above them was able to be affected by our thinking, and that respect that grew in between. So actually going back, closing the loop, I think is great. The group has made a fantastic suggestion to get back to that meeting as soon as possible. This next one, Dr. McGowan is a thoughtful and reflective leader. It's important to hear from people that demonstrate thoughtful humility. You can imagine, as I heard the story and the power of which Kevin told it, I said, I really want this to be out in front of people so they can actually hear the story in that way. So I'm just going to wholeheartedly agree with that one.
I'd like to thank my mom and 16 other family members that must have written those nice comments. So thanks, Mom.
Thanks, Mom. It was literally your mom. She actually did not say very nice things about you.
No, yeah, those have been filtered out, moderated.
This was an open forum for open feedback. We had a demographic question about your family, and we'll talk to you about that afterwards. It seems like the process of thought exchange will increase positive engagement on issues. Often issues arise where people get defensive. I mean, I think this is an important issue because people often ask me, what's the best possible application for thought exchange? And I mean, that's one way to be able to describe it. It's when people are very likely to get defensive and where things are very likely to get polarized. Maybe you can actually tie in these two questions too. They're kind of coming in pairs, where often things are interesting when people get defensive, which is like, well, how did you actually process this data to avoid people just using the data to verify their point of view and maintain their level of this is how I think? How did you actually use the information to effectively bring people together and not actually create further polarization? Because I know one thing that often happens in engagement is that the more you put people in groups, the more people are put in groups. And oftentimes research methodology is to try to figure out how people are different, not how they're the same. And so I'm curious how that resonates with you. Is how did the process with the data with the stakeholders afterwards, how do you use that to not just have them maintain their point of view?
Right. So I think this is what's something really interesting to me about Thought Exchange is it's not a format that lends itself to further dividing people. Part of that is a compliment to the people engaged in it too, and the people in our community that have engaged in it, because when they have seen other people's thinking, whether it was through our climate check or through this particular exchange, they've been open to different ideas and open to thinking differently and positively embracing the feedback that their community was giving them. But part of what our journey to Thought Exchange had to do with were particular kind of single issue groups, I'll just say, that over the past year and a half, and I think as a result of kind of the larger political conversations happening in our country and the the kind of negative public discourse that's out there. People are staking out these very single issue positions, and there is no room for compromise. And when we would have discussions, and we've noticed this more and more in a very collaborative place, when we have discussions about issues or particular projects, initiatives, if we didn't agree 100% with the advocates that were bringing this to us, then we were crazy, we were nuts, and we didn't care. Even if we were explaining very reasonably. For example, we had a decision that would have cost quite a bit of money. It was to change our start time at our secondary level. And the only way we could do it was if we had all these other implications and negative aspects of the decision. And people involved in that discussion just couldn't wrap their head around trusting that that was coming from the right place. I think there were people in the group that really felt like we just didn't want to do it for whatever reason. It was inconvenient, or we just didn't agree with it, whatever it was. And this was a situation where we said, no, let's engage in a conversation about this. And they exchanged the climate check at the end of the year allowed that group of people to voice that concern, but for them to also see that not everybody in the community felt that way. That in fact, people didn't star that as high as they would have thought. And people offered alternative thoughts and said, hey, you should be asking kids about this in a different way than you have, because they're not big fans of it. So we learned a lot more about it, but we didn't just learn about it. Everybody in the exchange learned more about it, unfiltered by us. They could really see how their community felt by it. So, it really, I think, brings people together far more than it ever divides them, because they are engaged in not just giving their perspective, they are receiving perspective at the same time.
So let maybe tie into that to the next one, so that, and actually I'll add a piece there, is that there is something that happens, is that one very practical thing is that after you share a thought, you get to see, as you're rating them, we're making sure that you're seeing that all those thoughts are getting seen equally. There's an empathy and an understanding just that happens through the process. And this question is really about how did you use the results to drive it? I just want to emphasize that what I heard through that is that it's really important to understand that the process itself helps people soften their point of view, actually, because they realize other people think differently than them, and they have to, it's just the ideas, it's not actually the people, they're not in an argument, they're just considering things. Maybe go to this next one. What are some of the next iterative questions or topics you imagine addressing based on the momentum you've created, engaging marginalized community members and addressing district issues?
So right now we're trying to figure out internally how to ask families who are not engaged. One of the aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion that we're tackling, we're looking at three really right now: our hiring process, special education, 4, restorative discipline practices, and family engagement. And in the area of family engagement, we'd like to learn more about how to better engage all the families in our community. So, and generally having a discussion about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Does everybody feel engaged? And if not, what more can we be doing around that? That obviously we'll craft a much better question than that. But we're trying to get that question, kind of working through that process right now with our diversity, equity committee, possibly engaging in an exchange around that. How engaged do you feel, and what more can we do to engage you? And hoping that we can do some really direct outreach to all members of our school community to answer that question, particularly, again, underrepresented members of our school community, because the answer for many overrepresented people is, well, I'm already engaged, I'm at everything, I do all those things, but we're trying to make sure in an environment where we're being more responsive and inclusive, how do we make sure that everybody is taking part in our school community, and what do we need to do to get that there? So that's one way. We're looking at an exchange around our school budget, have that planned for the springtime. I should say late January or so early February, to essentially ask, what should we be thinking about in terms of deploying resources next year? How do you feel about our school budget or the decisions we're currently making? We'll do another climate check in the springtime. But I think an interesting thought that we have right now, actually based on the discussions we had last week, is around the environment that we're creating for our staff and for our students, but primarily from a human resource perspective. We asked a question earlier this year in our central office about how we can make this the best work environment we possibly can. What are the things that we ought to be doing to make this a place that we think it's pretty positive right now, but what more can we be doing to make this the ideal job for you? And thinking about an activity we went through last week, making sure that this is the place that everybody is just dying to come to, wants to be a part of, wants to get out of bed every morning and commit themselves to, and that they're passionate about that work, realizing that if you're doing that, then you're getting much more on the other end in terms of their engagement with kids and the quality of the work. Again, feel very good about the quality of the work that's happening from our staff, but how do we build upon a good work environment that we currently have by asking people, what more can we do to help you? What more can we do to support you? What more can we do to make this a more satisfying job for you? And that's an exchange right now. We're thinking about how to do that in each of our buildings. We have a big capital project happening. We've done a phasing plan for our elementary building, and it's going to be a nightmare for the staff in that building over the next several years with lots of construction. We've shared all that with them, but now we want to go out and do an exchange and say, how do you feel about it? What more do we need to know? What should we be thinking about?
That's great. Thank Kevin. I mean, there's lots of things, and I also want to put a shameless plug for. You can hear Kevin and I referring to an event that we were at in Austin, where we pulled together superintendents from across North America, actually Canada and the United States, and had lots of meaningful discussions about this sort of stuff and sharing best practices, things like that. And the shameless plug is that for those superintendents on this call, there is another one coming up in March in San Diego to do a collaborative working session to really learn from one another about these sort of topics. And you don't have to be a Thoughtexchange client to attend. You can come and check out and meet people and have those sort of conversations. Let's go a couple more. We have 5 minutes left. One is, did you get a lot of polarized opinions either way? Were there people who were really unwilling to star some middle ground on this, or in general, was it more evenly balanced? Maybe a comment on that, or is that something that you actually thought about?
I think it was pretty equally distributed between people who were polarized and said, I don't know why you wouldn't just do this. And I shouldn't say equally distributed. There were those comments. They were probably in the minority. Then there were a bunch of comments in the middle. You know, this seems like a good idea, but maybe I need more information. Maybe I didn't understand the program or the objective. And then there were very polarized opinions, and I don't say polarized in a negative way, but very clear opinions. This is a bad idea. We're not thoughtful enough about this. Think about the impact it's having on all kids. There wasn't a ton of middle ground. That's
great. Until people rated, and then the middle ground is sort of found. I think that's important. I think
that's a good point. Yep.
I think this is interesting is how do you deal with people trying to control the conversation or the platform their own agenda? I'm worried about people spreading lies. I'm going to comment on this first, and I'll hand it over to you. Is that having seen hundreds of leaders use this, there's a real distinction between I'm asking a question and involving you in a conversation versus let's just go on social media and say whatever we want and see whether or not we can get support for what we're talking about. I've actually had people lean really into that and say, well, frankly, if people are spreading lies, then it's actually something that is catching on. If they're saying, well, the reason why this is happening is because of these 1, 2, and 3 lies. If those lies come up to the top, what a fantastic opportunity for you to be able to clarify and say, wow, everyone believes something that is not true. And if those lies go down to the bottom, you go, wow, no one believes them. Fantastic. People tried to say it's for this, this, and this. But either way, it's a leadership opportunity because you're the one starting the conversation. I think that's really important, is instead of the conversation happening around you, you're actually the one inviting the feedback. So if you hear something that's not true, well, frankly, you can just speak to it and say, oh, that's great that it came to the top, because what an opportunity to clarify that this is actually not true, but everyone apparently thinks it is. Maybe you can just comment to, you're asking some hard questions, yet how did you gain confidence that this would not happen, that it would not be taken over, et cetera?
Well, first of all, the social media point is a really good one to emphasize, because when we have a Facebook page with parents on it who occasionally have put things up that were inaccurate, and we have no control over that. It's not us. It's a parent page. And then we have tried very unsuccessfully at different times to put a comment up, myself personally. Hey, actually, it's not true. Why don't you give us a call? We can talk about it. The problem is that dialogue is hard to keep track of. There's 150 comments before you know it. Your clarification is way up in the comment section. Nobody sees it. It just spirals out of control, and there's no accountability for it. These are people just kind of shouting, right? But in the exchange, it just doesn't happen that way. For one, if people are lying, in the moderation of it, there's some control over that, right? So if they're using people's names or hurtful comments off topic, you have some control there. The other issue is that because you can enter a comment in the exchange yourself, not a comment, but a response to a comment, and have that ability. We did use that actually in this exchange. There were a few inaccurate comments that we very quickly and politely could say, actually, we haven't received a report about that, but we'd like to know more, let us know. Or somebody asked a direct question, we could actually answer that question about training or implementation, whatever it was. So you can provide clarity, and it's right there on the comment, and it doesn't allow for people to layer onto that comment. So it's so different from social media. You can actually clarify something, people see it right there. But there's some self-monitoring that happens too, because some of those more outlandish things just won't get a high star rating. People won't do that. And if they happen to, because somehow it is believable to some people, I agree with the leader that said that to you. It gives you a tremendous opportunity to say, you know, I would have rated that a 5 too had that been true, but guess what? It's not. And it's really important. And I'm glad that you all rated that so highly so that I could address that topic directly.
That's fantastic. Listen, there's a few other great things in here. How do you land on the final questions? I just want to say our team works pretty close with folks, and we also connect leaders with leaders. I think we don't have time to dig into that right now, but teamwork and connecting leaders with leaders is really how we do that. And we're going to go back and work with Kevin to actually go through a little deeper into this list, because I think we got through a really great amount in the time that we had. And so as everyone, we're at the top of the hour, I want to thank you, Kevin, for telling that story and for being vulnerable, and I think a great example of what a leader, transformative leader looks like, and for you to be willing to share that. And I also want to thank everyone else who came out to hear that story. And I really encourage you to take these things and share them, because a lot of what we do, I think, as leaders is find the best things and grab onto them and then share them out more and go with what works unabashedly. So thank you very much, Kevin. Any final words for everyone out there?
I just really appreciate that comment, and thank you. But I also thank you for helping us create an environment where we were able to help our peers and alleviate some pain for people in our community because of this. So thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a fantastic morning or afternoon, depending on your time zone, and come back for upcoming Leadership Discussion Live, and maybe we'll see you down in San Diego. Talk to you soon.